Okay, so this might be a little bit of a shock, but the video game world has been having a meltdown lately because of the release of Baldur's Gate 3, potentially the greatest adaptation of a tabletop game to digital since Pong. And this has raised a massive question in the minds of wargamers everywhere. A question that for 30 years we have all been too afraid to ask. Why the hell isn't there a Warhammer video game? Where's my Warhammer video game? Okay, now stop. I see you typing in the comment section about Warhammer Snotling Fling. I'm not talking about that type of game. I'm talking about a Warhammer video game that is Warhammer, you know, the war game, but digital. Because that's what Baldur's Gate 3 is. That's what's blowing everyone's minds right now. It takes place in the Dungeons and Dragons setting, sure, but more importantly, it authentically replicates the Dungeons and Dragons mechanics and tabletop war game rule set more successfully than any game that's ever come before. It's pretty incredible, and it's breaking all sorts of records from player base size to copies sold as a result. These are huge milestones for a game, primarily about rolling a d20 to see how well you can stab a goblin. With your sword, I see you in the back. Your filthy imagination. But the success of Baldur's Gate 3 has left me wondering, why is there no Baldur's Gate 3 for Warhammer? Sure, there are plenty of video games set in the various Warhammer settings. We have Dawn of War, Space Marine, Vermintide, Darktide, Gladius, Warforged, Total War Warhammer, Mechanicus, and 1,000 awful mobile game ports. And lots of these games are really fun. Not the mobile game ports, but a lot of the games do a great job of representing the various settings of Warhammer. Darktide nailed the aesthetic of living in a hive. Total War Warhammer is the pinnacle of the Warhammer fantasy setting. And Dawn of War by Relic is still in my top 10 video games of all time. In fact, it was such a good depiction of Warhammer that it convinced me to finally give the Warhammer miniature game a try all the way back in 2004. Wasn't that long ago, it was very recent actually. Living memory. And I wasn't alone either. That's the power of video games. They're so accessible to so many people, and they're popular. They're massively mainstream these days, and the audience for them are just so much larger than the inbuilt audiences for tabletop experiences with less barriers to entry, which is weird because they require like consoles and PCs and stuff, but hey, easier to get those than other people. That's social atomization, ladies and gentlemen. I know me. But Baldur's Gate 3 is just the latest example of what a tabletop game can do for a semi-niche tabletop franchise. A lot of money and popularity. And don't get me wrong, I'm happy that there's a lot of popular, successful Warhammer video games out there in all sorts of different genres, but they all still have a single uniting factor that ultimately makes them nothing like Baldur's Gate 3. None of them are the game. None of them are Warhammer. I mean, sure, they're in the setting of Warhammer, but they're not, you know, Warhammer. They aren't a video game adaptation of the actual war game Warhammer 40k or Warhammer Fantasy, in the way that Baldur's Gate 3 is a literal reproduction of the Dungeons and Dragons 5th edition rules in a digital medium, with some amendments here and there to make the game work better in a digital format and be a little bit more cogent. We've never had a video game version of Warhammer, not in the 30-odd years of licensed Warhammer video games. And that's kinda weird, right? I mean, yeah, there's been some games that accurately portray the tabletop experience of Warhammer, but they have tended to be for smaller, more self-contained experiences, and the specialty games. Blood Bowl by Cyanide, for example, is a video game that replicates the tabletop experience of Blood Bowl into a digital one, pretty faithfully, for better or worse. They even released new editions of the video game to keep up with the new editions of the tabletop game. And interestingly, when Cyanide tried to sell the video game equivalent of upgrade sprues in Blood Bowl 3, the entire community had a pretty well justified meltdown, and it utterly killed the game on release. Yeesh. Weird that people don't have a similar problem when it comes to miniatures, but hey, let's move on. And no video game has sought to translate the big war game experience into the digital realm of like 40k, for example. I mean, the greatest Warhammer games tend to just take the setting of Warhammer and use it as a skin to wear, like a flayed one, translating the setting into a new type of video game experience, a new playable experience. Dawn of War was a real-time strategy game. Space Marine was a third-person action game, and Total War Warhammer was a total war game, but you know, with Warhammer. And as far as I'm aware, there's never even been a whiff of a suggestion that we're ever going to get a video game depicting the actual war game either. And I just find that kind of weird, you know? And this has become increasingly odd as the rate of new Warhammer video games have stepped up from a big event, an occasional release every few years, to a mad crescendo of dozens of new Warhammer games every other month. A decade or two ago, Warhammer video games were pretty rare, but now it seems like Games Workshop are throwing licensing adaptation agreements to passing tourists coming out of Warhammer World. They absolutely love licensing the Warhammer brand these days. I mean, look at their annual reports and it's easy to see why. Licensing the Warhammer brand has made them a lot of money. Even better because it comes without any of those pesky manufacturing costs that creating miniatures and books and products come with. Games Workshop is increasingly becoming a multimedia company, hence their absolute obsession with Warhammer Plus. And that is the future of the company. And licensing a brand like Warhammer is really easy and profitable to do. And just recently, they even opened up a job application for a brand assurance representative who will work with third parties to make sure that Warhammer video games and animations accurately represent the 40k and Age of Sigmar IP. Not the war game, the IP. And that's kinda the tone from Games Workshop. They seem to be more interested in pushing the brand IP rather than, you know, the actual game of Warhammer, the core product. But why? A video game adaptation of their actual tabletop game seems like low-hanging fruit, the obvious choice of focusing a video game around. You know, digitizing the game into a game? Is it just that no video game studio has ever pitched Games Workshop on this idea in the last 30 years? That none of them believe it is possible to translate a Warhammer 40k tabletop game into a video game experience? Well, I mean, I don't think so. Baldur's Gate 3 exists, and there's nothing that makes Dungeons & Dragons any easier to translate to digital gaming than Warhammer 40k in my opinion. And D&D is a game all about rolling dice to simulate attacks, making tactical decisions, and mixing together a bunch of mechanics to do things that the designers never originally intended. Does that remind you of any other games? Because it sure as hell reminds me of Warhammer. And sure, players put on funny accents while rolling said dice on the tabletop, but who hasn't screamed "Wah!" when moving their orcs across a Warhammer board? No, I think it's more likely that Games Workshop have just rejected any pitch to put the Warhammer wargame in the digital sphere. I think there's two potential major explanations for that. The first is that Games Workshop might not want people to be able to play a digital version of Warhammer without having to buy the hundreds of thousands of pounds worth of expensive miniatures first. See, as much as people love to talk about the Warhammer hobby and include watching YouTube videos and that, ultimately the actual war game is the core product of Warhammer because, you know, it's part of the miniature wargame hobby. And that part of it makes the most money for Games Workshop. That's kind of their focus. And I suspect that Games Workshop may be worried that a digital video game might cannibalize their actual sales of miniatures. I mean, after all, Blood Bowl that we talked about earlier only came out as a video game after the physical tabletop game had been discontinued first. And then the success of that, I think, kind of convinced them to bring the tabletop game back, making a sort of weird kind of Russian doll scenario, but one goes back in. And if this is true, if this is what they actually think, I think it's a mistake on Games Workshop's part. Mostly because I think that a digital version of Warhammer 40k would lead to tons more sales of their miniatures. And as evidence of that, I just need to point to Tabletop Simulator, a video game that people already routinely use to play Warhammer digitally. And yet, the war game has continued to grow. It hasn't hurt it at all. In fact, probably probably the opposite. People are trying out all sorts of crazy lists on Tabletop Simulator, and some of those are extremely expensive, things that people would never have tried if they didn't have a digital space to do so. And also, Games Workshop's current video game adaptations primarily get people to fall in love with the Warhammer setting. And don't get me wrong, there's definitely a segment of people who will play Space Marine 2 and resolve themselves to jump all in on the Warhammer war game and fall in love with it, like I did in 2004 after playing Dawn of War. But I would bet that it's a smaller proportion of players compared to the number of people who are going to play Baldur's Gate 3, roleplay as a bard, fall in love with the game mechanics, and resolve to actually get a few of their friends together to actually play some Dungeons and Dragons in real life. You see, that's what happens when you get people to fall in love not only with the setting, but the game as well. They want to play it. Getting people to play the Warhammer war game in a more accessible format would, in my opinion, translate to more players of the tabletop game, leading to more money for Games Workshop in the long term.
Money can be exchanged for goods and services.
So if this is the reason why they've never done a Warhammer Wargame video game, then I think it's a pretty myopic one. The second explanation could be that Games Workshop are simply too insecure to put the Warhammer Wargame in a video game. They might not have enough faith in the core Warhammer product. And let's be honest here, Warhammer's setting does have a stronger pull than the mechanics of its wargame. It's basically the opposite of D&D, whose mechanics are a stronger pull than the setting. I mean, don't get me wrong, I like D&D as much as the next nerd, but the Faerun setting of Baldur's Gate could have been any generic fantasy setting, and it really wouldn't have negated the fun much. Dawn of War, outside the Warhammer setting though, it just doesn't work. It's simply Company of Heroes, which is a fun game, but sorry Hitler, World War II just ain't as fun as an IP. And if this is true, I think it's a massive pity. It does a disservice to the Warhammer wargame. I mean, people like to rag on Warhammer's gameplay, but it's not without fans, and it has a lot of dedicated players, and in my opinion, the games are fun. I honestly believe that if you took Warhammer 40k the wargame and amended it slightly to make it more palatable to a digital format, the way that the Baldur's Gate 3 dev Larian did with D&D, it would go a long way to creating hundreds of thousands of new Warhammer fans. Not everybody's gonna fall in love with it, but lots of people will. And importantly, they'd be Warhammer wargame fans. It would translate into more people playing the game, not just buying Black Library books or watching lore videos on YouTube, but visiting local hobby stores, buying dice, buying measuring tape, glue, and clippers, picking up the infrastructure that's needed to play wargames, normalizing the idea of playing miniature wargames, not just being into Space Marines. With Baldur's Gate 3 right now, if you fall in love with that game, there's a clear pipeline for new players. You buy the dice, you buy the books, and you play the tabletop Dungeons and Dragons. It's even funner. And then you're in the RPG hobby. You might move on to Pathfinder for a little bit more crunch to your game, or Delta Green for a more horror experience, or Powered by the Apocalypse for reasons that I'm yet to decipher. Sorry, Tabletop Bro. But you come away from the game encouraged to actually play RPGs and join the tabletop RPG hobby, not just read a couple of books set in the Forgotten Realms. And that's going to be the legacy of Baldur's Gate 3. It has given tabletop gaming its biggest shot in the arm since Field Marshal von Falkenschnoodle realized that rolling 3d6 could pretty accurately simulate the odds of a dragon eating a halfling, and decided that all his chums at the Schnitzel Club must know about it. France later fell. With Warhammer video games though, I mean, you fall in love with Dawn of War the video game, and then you get into the tabletop Warhammer 40k game and either bounce right off because it's nothing like Dawn of War, or you just stay playing Warhammer exclusively for 10 years, like I did. I mean, I was lucky to find out that other games even exist and realize that the hobby is so much bigger than a single franchise, unless that's the point. In which case, it's massively short-sighted. Warhammer needs a Baldur's Gate 3. It's better for Warhammer, it's better for Wargaming, it's better for everybody. But if you're not convinced that Baldur's Gate 3 is that good and a justification for a Warhammer Wargame video game, well, it is. But let me prove it to you in this video here. And I want to give a huge thanks to my patrons, especially CryptoKev, Mistress RB Novany, and Travis Hunter. I really appreciate it, guys. And I'll catch y'all next time. Bye-bye!